living longer, living healthier, living better than ever before. Welcome to Mountain Pacific's Healthy Living for Life, a weekly series that gives you the information, education, and expert insight you need to become an active participant in today's ever-changing healthcare climate. Here now is today's program host.
Many of us are looking for the best way to lose a little weight and feel healthier. One way you may have heard about, especially lately, is intermittent fasting. But how healthy is it really? Welcome to Healthy Living for Life, a show dedicated to helping you do just that. I'm your host, Beth Brown, and today we're going to learn about intermittent fasting, the pros, the cons, and the potential dangers. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Healthy Living for Life. Joining us this morning is Dr. Mark Mattson, PhD, who is an adjunct professor of neuroscience at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. We're very fortunate to have you with us this morning. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Mattson.
Well, I'm delighted to talk to you about intermittent fasting.
Okay, well, let's jump into it then, and let's start with talking about what we're talking about. So what is intermittent fasting? How is it supposed to work?
Well, the first thing is it's not a diet, it's an eating pattern. A diet is what you eat and how much. Intermittent fasting are eating patterns in which you go extended times of period with no or very low calorie intake. And typically, the most common approaches in humans have been, it's called daily time restricted eating, where you compress the time window each day you eat into, say, 6 to 8 hours, so that you're fasting up to 18 hours every day.
Wow.
And another approach is what's called 5-2 intermittent fasting, where a couple days a week you eat only one moderate sized meal. The other 5 days eat normally. So anyway, those are the kind of eating patterns that are considered intermittent fasting.
Okay, and you're the perfect person to answer this question. What's the science behind this eating pattern?
Well, as often happens, it started in animals. It had been known for a long time that daily calorie restriction can extend lifespan in rats or mice. And others had found that intermittent fasting, every other day fasting, can extend lifespan in the animals by up to 50%. So anyway, this is a huge effect on lifespan. And also, we found that in animals that intermittent fasting is beneficial for the brain. It can protect the brain against dysfunction and degeneration in animal models that are relevant to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and stroke.
Wow. So when did all of that start? How long has intermittent fasting kind of come along?
The animal studies started in the 1990s. The human studies started in the early 2000s. My lab was involved in the first published study on intermittent fasting in humans, which was in asthma patients in 2007, where we found beneficial effects. And since then, there's been a proliferation of human studies, mostly in people with obesity, but also in healthy people, as well as in certain diseases like cancer, for example.
And it's growing in popularity outside of the academic setting. Why do you think that is?
Well, as you know, obesity and being overweight is a big problem in this country.
Yeah.
And it turns out that many people can reduce their overall calorie intake by doing intermittent fasting. So, for example, I mentioned daily compression of your eating window to 6 to 8 hours. Most people actually put something in their mouth caloric from the time they get up to right before they go to bed.
Yeah.
So it turns out that for many people, it's a way to limit overall calorie intake and lose weight. And psychologically, many people find it easier than counting calories at each meal. So there's kind of both, it's a way to reduce overall energy intake for people with obesity.
Okay.
Or who are overweight.
Sure. And so does it also restrict what you eat, or is it just strictly when you eat?
So I'm a proponent of eating a healthy diet. So intermittent fasting is not a license to eat junk food. We actually have found in animal studies that intermittent fasting can counteract somewhat the adverse effects of feeding the animals a McDonald's diet, fructose in their drinking water and high saturated fat. Animals will develop obesity, and intermittent fasting, even when they're on that bad diet, can have beneficial effects, although they're not as healthy as they would be if they were eating a healthy diet.
And what about exercise? Does that play a role, or is it just really about the eating?
Well, exercise is very important. It's for the cardiovascular system, and we think even for the brain, it has profound beneficial effects. And it turns out that when we get down to what's happening in the cells and organ systems in response to exercise and intermittent fasting, there's some similarities. Both of them cause cells in our body and brain to become more resilient, better able to cope with stress. So in a way, intermittent fasting is kind of a mild stress. It's a challenge to our metabolic system.
Yeah.
And our cells and organs respond adaptively to these challenges of exercise or fasting in ways that help them function better and be more resistant to stress and disease.
I think we have time for one more question before we have to take a break here. So you talked about that it's kind of a stress. How long does it take for a person to adjust to this kind of an eating schedule?
Yeah, that's a very important question because it doesn't happen right away. It takes several weeks to a month. And many times I'll get people come to me, they say, well, I normally eat breakfast, I skip breakfast, I can't do that because I feel I'm very hungry and irritable in the morning. And they will be for several weeks. And then it kind of dissipates and that completely goes away.
Okay. All right. We do need to pause here for a couple of commercials, Dr. Mattson, but stick with us because when we come back, we're going to talk about whether people with certain conditions should maybe steer away from intermittent fasting. We'll talk about some risks and a lot more right after this. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're still talking with Dr. Mark Mattson from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And thanks again for being here this morning, Dr. Mattson. Let's talk about certain groups of people who might think about intermittent fasting and need to balance it with some chronic health conditions that they might be trying to manage. So let's start with diabetes. Should people with diabetes try intermittent fasting? What have you found there?
Animal studies and several published human studies have shown that people with type 2 diabetes, intermittent fasting can be an effective way of helping them manage their blood glucose levels. It will increase insulin sensitivity. In other words, it enhances the body's ability to remove glucose from the blood. So on the other hand, type 1 diabetes, which the people's pancreas isn't working, it isn't producing insulin, they have to take insulin. That's very important. They consult with their doctor before they, try to do intermittent fasting, because what might happen, they might become more insulin sensitive and actually be more prone to hypoglycemia. But for type 2 diabetes, at this point, there's all the evidence point in a positive direction that it can be beneficial.
Okay, great. Another big chronic condition that a lot of people in America deal with, heart health, blood pressure. So let's talk about that as far as, is it safe for people who are trying to manage their blood pressure to take a look at intermittent fasting?
The answer is yes. This has been shown. Actually, there have been human studies looking at the cardiovascular system, and we did some studies in animal. And what happens is, after you start intermittent fasting over a period of many weeks, typically people's resting heart rate and blood pressure will go down a little bit. And from a scientific standpoint, we think we know why, and it actually turns out to be a similar mechanism whereby exercise lowers resting heart rate and blood pressure. It has to do with what's called the autonomic nervous system that controls heart rate and blood pressure. And it's not as good as exercise quantitatively in improving blood pressure, but the data out there suggests it can help somewhat.
Okay. How about women who are pregnant or are trying to get pregnant?
The answer is we don't know.
Okay.
There have been no studies in people who are pregnant or trying to get pregnant. We do know that women with obesity or type 2 diabetes, when they're pregnant, they're prone to kind of adverse effects during pregnancy, but also their children are more likely to have poor outcomes in terms of developing obesity and even autism.
Okay.
So I think the point is that women who are pregnant, it's important for them to keep active, at least mild activity, and not overeat if they're already overweight.
Okay. How about different age groups? Have you seen younger people or older people responding differently to intermittent fasting?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not much known about that. There have been no studies in children, no studies well, there have been a couple studies in normal healthy people, kind of, let's say 65 age range. But I would caution people, elderly people who already are losing muscle mass and, getting, to where they may be becoming frail. They still need to, as much as they can, keep physically active and get enough protein intake for their muscles. So that could be a caution. We just don't know. There haven't been studies done.
Okay, and you mentioned muscle mass, and that is something that a JAMA Internal Medicine article published about, that people are losing muscle when they're losing weight with intermittent fasting. Should people be careful about that? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, so there have been, the studies you mentioned is interesting. They didn't take exercise into account in that study. And there have been at least 3 published studies I know, very well done studies, in people who are doing resistance training. Now these aren't older people, they're kind of young to middle-aged people. And in those studies, they found that those people can maintain and build muscle mass while they are doing intermittent fasting.
Are there warning signs that people should look out for if they're trying intermittent fasting and their body is not dealing with it well for some reason? What are some of the symptoms or signs we should be aware of?
Yeah, well, there's the kind of non-really important symptoms that I mentioned of, getting hungry and irritable as you're adapting to intermittent fasting. Beyond that, if someone already has a low body weight, very low body weight, it's important that they maintain their body weight. And so, they may run into a situation, say they're doing time-restricted eating where they aren't getting enough calories to maintain their body weight. So in healthy, normal or low weight, say athletes or people who are physically active, if they go on intermittent fasting, just make sure they get enough energy and protein and other nutrients so that they maintain their body weight.
Okay. All right, thank you. We've bumped up against another break here, so we do need to pause. But when we come back, we're going to dive into even more pros and cons and discuss a little bit more about intermittent fasting. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Dr. Mark Mattson from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine is still with us. And you talked about that there are folks who should discuss with their doctor before starting intermittent fasting. What kind of questions should they ask their doctor to bring up this topic?
Well, they should ask them, if this might be a good way for them to, reduce their risk for disease, or if they already have some type 2 diabetes, which we mentioned, or they're overweight. And what they should do ideally is have the doctor do some blood work initially, particularly look at blood glucose, blood lipids, kind of get an idea on insulin sensitivity. And then they should, if they're going to go on intermittent fasting, then schedule another meeting with their doctor a couple months later after they've been doing intermittent fasting for a couple months, and have them do the same blood work and see if things are going in a good direction.
Okay.
Which in many people they will be. And that's kind of a good way for them to monitor their progress too over time.
Okay, great. That's great advice. So is intermittent fasting something someone can do forever? It's a lifestyle change and you can just keep doing it and it's not something that's limited for you?
Well, you're looking at someone who's been doing it their whole life since I was 30, no, not even 30, 26 or 7.
Okay.
Back then it was for other reasons. I just started, when I was in graduate school, I was really busy. So I just skipped breakfast, started skipping breakfast, and I never went back to eating breakfast. Yeah, it can be a lifestyle incorporated into the lifestyle. And a lot of people find this daily time restricted eating easy to incorporate it into their daily routine. The easiest for most people is just to skip breakfast and get to work.
Sure. A lot of people probably do that already, but then they make up for those calories as they go along. So that's probably the key there, I would guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And you mentioned that there were some results that showed that intermittent fasting protects your brain. What's happening there? Why is that something that might help Alzheimer's or dementia?
Yeah. Well, so I mentioned we found in animal studies it can counteract quote unquote Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and lessen brain damage and improve functional outcome in those diseases as well as mild as stroke. In humans, there's only been a couple studies done. They're kind of, so it's early days in humans. There's at least one study showing improvements in some aspects of cognition, that is learning and memory. We just finished but haven't published a study in people at risk for cognitive impairment. They're between the ages of 55 and 70. They have obesity and insulin resistance. And anyway, we're doing a battery of cognitive tests before and 2 months after they go on intermittent fasting, a lot of blood work, functional brain imaging to look at neural network activity in their brains. And so, probably over the coming months, we'll be getting those data together. So there's a lot of interest in this. And as far as the human studies, they're in an exponential growth. A lot of human studies are going on now. A lot of funding from the NIH, for example, now for carefully done studies.
Okay. Are there any indications of what intermittent fasting might do for someone who is struggling with mental health issues or having trouble with mental health, negatively or positively?
We don't know for sure. Okay. We do see in animal studies some changes in the brain that are similar to what are seen with exercise. We have seen what I would call an anti-anxiety effect, where we have ways to test anxiety levels in animals. But there haven't been in human studies. There haven't been studies of intermittent fasting in people with depression or other mood disorders. We know exercise is a very, very powerful, actually, antidepressant. And again, we see some of the changes in the brain with intermittent fasting looking at what's happening in the neural networks that are similar to exercise. So maybe.
Okay. So I have heard some criticism with intermittent fasting that it encourages binge eating because people are trying to stuff food into those, hours that they have to eat. What's your advice, or can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, they shouldn't have to stuff food into the time windows that I'm talking about, 6 to 8 hours. For example, I eat lunch and dinner, and I may have something healthy snack in between. And, I've done this for 40 years. And my body weight hasn't changed much, and I don't do binge eating. But yeah, I mean, intuitively, it kind of makes sense that particularly like adolescent girls, right, who are prone to anorexia, intuitively you think it might not be good, but on the other hand, there's no data, we don't know.
Okay. Then let's talk about energy and how basically that's what food is supposed to do for us, right? Is give us energy. So how does that work with, that scheduled time period?
Well, that's an important point. So during these extended fasts, your body switches from using sugar, glucose, which is stored in your liver, to using fat and what are called ketones, which are derived from the fats. Yeah. And, during evolution, animals, including humans, had to survive not just 18 hours a day without food, but a week without food, right? So during evolution, our bodies and brains evolved to function very well in a food deprived state, because if our cells aren't getting energy in a food deprived state, we're not going to function well. Mm-hmm. And if we don't function well, we're not going to survive and pass our genes on to the next generation. So the point is that we evolved to function very well in a food-deprived state.
Okay.
And I think people will actually find during the fasting period, their brains and maybe even their athletic performance is better than when they're in the fed state.
Okay. So any final thoughts? We're about out of time here. What should we take away today?
We can take away that intermittent fasting can be incorporated into people's daily and weekly lifestyle routines, that it takes an adaptation period of several weeks or a month to adapt, kind of like exercise. It takes a while to get in shape and adapt to exercise. Sure. And those are kind of the two key take-home messages.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for all your information, Dr. Mattson. I've learned a lot. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, and thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll come back and see us again next weekend. Until then, stay fit, stay well, and stay healthy for life with Healthy Living for Life. Have a great week, everybody.
Healthy Living for Life is brought to you by Mountain Pacific Quality Health. We'd love to hear from you. If you have suggestions for future programs, visit our website at mpqhf.org or call us at 406-443-4020. You can also catch us on YouTube by visiting our website and clicking on the Healthy Living for Life logo. Production facilities provided by Video Express Productions.